In February 1862, the commander of a besieged Confederate fort handed control of his army to a subordinate, climbed onto a steamboat in the middle of the night, and left roughly 12,000 of his own men behind to surrender without him. He was not the only general in this war who chose his own safety over his command at the exact moment his men needed him most. Some ran from battlefields in broad daylight while their own soldiers stood and fought. Some abandoned forts they had sworn to hold. Some left written records of their panic so detailed that historians didn't even need to guess what happened. The men themselves confessed it. This is the story of the 5 most cowardly generals of the Civil War, men whose names once commanded armies and now carry a very different kind of legacy. Cowardice in a general is different from cowardice in almost any other position of authority, because the cost of it is measured in other people's lives, not just reputations. A coward in a boardroom loses money. A coward commanding an army loses the men who trusted him to lead them out alive. And history has an uncomfortable habit of remembering exactly which commanders made that choice and which ones didn't. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. Start with the man who ran first. Gideon Pillow commanded Confederate forces at Fort Donelson in February 1862, a fortification on the Cumberland River that Union troops under Ulysses Grant had surrounded and were preparing to overwhelm. Pillow had every opportunity to organize a breakout and lead his men to safety, and for a brief window on February 15th, his forces actually succeeded in punching a hole through the Union lines that could have let the entire garrison escape. Then, inexplicably, Pillow ordered his troops back inside the fort instead of pressing the advantage. That night, with surrender now the only realistic option left, Pillow made his priorities clear. He handed command to his subordinate, Simon Bolivar Buckner, climbed aboard a small steamer, and escaped upriver before dawn, leaving Buckner to negotiate the surrender of nearly 12,000 men. Buckner, who stayed and accepted responsibility for a defeat he hadn't caused, became one of the most respected officers in the Confederate Army. Pillow became a punchline. Confederate President Jefferson Davis was reportedly so disgusted by the escape that he removed Pillow from meaningful command for the rest of the war. Years later, when Pillow tried to explain his decision, he claimed he believed his personal capture would have been a disaster for Confederate morale, as though the 12,000 men he left behind mattered less than his own preservation. Pillow did not escape alone, and his superior officers' reasons for running make the story even stranger. John B. Floyd, the senior commander at Fort Donelson, had a motive for fleeing that had nothing to do with the battle unfolding around him at all. Before the war, Floyd had served as United States Secretary of War under President Buchanan, and rumors already circulating in the North accused him of funneling federal weapons and money to southern states in the months before secession, accusations that, if he were captured, could have meant a treason trial rather than the standard treatment given to a prisoner of war. Floyd decided he could not afford to find out. When the fort's surrender became inevitable, he did what Pillow did, only first, commandeering the garrison steamboats for his own Virginia regiments and pulling out before Union forces closed in completely, leaving the bulk of the army for Buckner to hand over. Floyd's own colonels reportedly urged him to reconsider, pointing out that thousands of men were being left behind while their commanding general secured his own transportation out. He left anyway. Robert E. Lee, upon hearing what had happened at Donelson, refused to give Floyd another field command for the remainder of the war. A man who had once controlled the entire United States military as its top civilian official had, when the moment finally came to stand and fight, chosen a boat instead. 18 months later, a Union commander would produce a version of the same story. Only this time it happened in broad daylight, in front of an entire army, with no fort or nightfall to hide behind. At the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863, a gap opened in the Union line through simple miscommunication, and Confederate forces under James Longstreet poured directly through it at exactly the worst possible moment for William Rosecrans, the Union general commanding that entire sector of the field that day. Rosecrans, caught in the collapsing right side of his own line as smoke and confusion swallowed his view of the battlefield, did not attempt to rally the troops around him or ride toward the sound of the fighting that was still very much underway. He turned his horse toward Chattanooga and rode for the rear, convinced the entire army was finished. What Rosecrans didn't know and didn't stay to find out was that his subordinate George Thomas had gathered the remaining Union forces on a ridge called Horseshoe Ridge and held the position through the rest of the day, buying time for the broken army to retreat in order rather than collapse entirely. Thomas earned the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga for that stand. Rosecrans earned a different kind of reputation, and Ulysses Grant relieved him of command within 2 months. What makes the comparison to Thomas so damning is that both men were looking at the exact same collapsing battlefield in the exact same hour. One of them saw a reason to run. The other saw a reason to stay. Rosecrans wasn't riding alone that afternoon either. Alexander McCook, one of his corps' commanders, fled the same collapsing field with enough haste that a formal court of inquiry was convened afterward specifically to determine whether his conduct at Chickamauga constituted a dereliction of duty serious enough to end his career. McCook testified that he believed the army was destroyed and that remaining on the field served no purpose, an explanation the inquiry board found unconvincing enough to recommend he never again be trusted with an active field command. McCook's flight raises a question the inquiry itself never fully resolved. Was he reading the battlefield accurately and making the same panicked judgment his commanding general made minutes later? Or was he simply the first man in the chain of command to lose his nerve, with Rosecrans following the example his own subordinate had already set? What makes McCook's case worth separating from Rosecrans's either way is the timeline. Testimony gathered during the inquiry suggested McCook had left the field even before it was fully clear the position was lost, riding toward Chattanooga on a route that put considerable distance between himself and the fighting well before his commanding general made the same decision. The inquiry stopped short of formally branding him a coward. It didn't need to. A general who is investigated by his own army for how quickly he left a battlefield has already answered the question everyone was asking, regardless of what the official findings said. The final name on this list belongs to a general who didn't just fail to hold his nerve. He lost to teenagers. Franz Sigel commanded Union forces at the Battle of New Market in May 1864, facing a Confederate force that included 257 cadets from the Virginia Military Institute, boys as young as 15 thrown into the line to fill a gap in the Confederate ranks. Sigel had a clear numerical advantage, functioning artillery support, and every conventional military reason to expect an easy victory that afternoon. Instead, confused orders, hesitant positioning, and a command style that subordinates openly questioned even before the battle began produced a collapse so complete that Sigel's army retreated in disarray, abandoning artillery pieces on the field rather than risk further engagement. Ulysses Grant, reviewing reports of the defeat, relieved Sigel of field command within days, reportedly remarking that if Sigel could not defeat a line partly staffed by schoolboys, he had no business commanding an army at all. 10 of those VMI cadets died in the fighting that day, and Sigel's own after-action report struggled to explain how a professionally trained force with every material advantage had been pushed off the field by teenagers who had never seen combat before that morning. Sigel spent the rest of the war in administrative roles far from any front line, a demotion that followed him for the remainder of his career, and a defeat that became almost immediately a permanent part of how Union commanders were measured against each other. What connects all 5 of these men isn't a single failure of nerve on a single afternoon. It's the pattern underneath it, a moment where the safety of the man in command outweighed the survival of the men following him, and where that choice, once made, followed each of them for the rest of their lives. Compare that to the men standing next to them in these same stories. Buckner stayed at Fort Donelson, accepted a surrender he hadn't caused, and became a name Southerners still respect a century and a half later. Thomas stayed at Chickamauga while his commanding officer rode for the rear and became a legend known ever since as the Rock of Chickamauga. Pillow, Floyd, Rosecrans, McCook, and Sigel chose differently, in moments that asked exactly one question of each of them, and history has never stopped answering it for them.